I want to be known as the president who, working with our allies and the Soviets and others, led to the elimination of all chemical and biological weapons from the face of the earth.
When Gaddafi built this chemical weapons plant in Libya, the U.S. administration was outraged. But the man who helped Gaddafi build it constructed a new chemical plant in Boca Raton, Florida. The FBI knew about it, the CIA knew about it, but no one moved to stop it.
This is an ABC News Nightline Financial Times of London investigation. Saddam's chemical connection. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
On July the 1st, 1990, Dr. Ishan Barbouti died for the second time, although there was even some question about that. Dr. Barbouti was, at various times in his life, a professor of architecture, a businessman, and a consultant to the Iraqi Ministry of Defense. In 1969, for reasons that are still not altogether clear, he faked his own death. Some believe he may have done the same thing again in July of last year. Dr. Barbouti, you see, had become the focus of a great deal of international attention. He was responsible for the construction between 1984 and 88 of a chemical weapons plant in Libya. You may recall hearing about it. The plant was at a place called Rabda. Washington was so concerned about that chemical plant that the Pentagon prepared contingency plans to bomb the place. President Reagan ordered 2 U.S. aircraft carriers to take up station off the Libyan coast. 2 Libyan aircraft were shot down at the time. Dr. Barbouti, in a story that was ultimately leaked to the New York Times, was described as a linchpin of Libya's huge new chemical weapons plant. So you would think that if this same Dr. Barbouti built a chemical plant in Boca Raton, Florida, a plant that produced a compound that can be made into extremely dangerous, highly toxic chemical weapons, and then shipped several drums of the material to Iraq, that the U.S. government might be interested, perhaps even a little concerned, especially since a number of people had gone out of their way to bring all of this to the attention of the FBI, U.S. Customs, and the CIA. But for some reason, nothing happened. No one moved against the plant for 3 years. Not a single U.S. government agency took action against Dr. Barbouti's chemical plant in Boca Raton until this March, by which time the plant was no longer in operation and Dr. Barbouti had been dead for almost a year. Strange story? You don't know the half of it. We'll tell you about it in detail when we come back.
This is an ABC News Nightline investigation, brought to you by the Diamond Anniversary Band. Nightline continues in a moment. ABC News Nightline Financial Times investigation continues. Once again, Ted Koppel.
We begin with a speech delivered in October of 1988 by Robert Gates. Mr. Gates works at the White House these days. In fact, President Bush has nominated him to be the next director of the CIA. On October 15th, 1988, however, Gates was deputy director of the CIA, speaking to the Association of Former Intelligence Officers. He was ticking off a list of problem areas around the world. The most immediate threat to world peace, said Gates, and to the security of the United States and all its allies may well come from the proliferation of chemical and biological warfare capabilities in the Third World. Chemical weapons, he said, have become the poor man's atomic bomb. And then he added, essentially, the technology needed to produce chemical weapons is not significantly more complicated than that required to produce fertilizer or soft drinks. Soft drinks and chemical weapons. Sounds like a bit of a stretch, doesn't it? But indeed, Mr. Gates was right on the money. Even as he was talking to the former intelligence officers, a Baton Rouge chemical engineering firm was finalizing design plans and equipment specifications for a plant that would produce natural cherry flavoring from apricot pits. The inventor of this process, Louis Champon, had been trying, unsuccessfully, for some time to find a partner to put up the necessary money. Most potential investors weren't interested, perhaps put off by the fact that extracting bitter almond oil, that's what gives you the natural cherry flavor, from fruit pits also creates a nasty byproduct, cyanide. Ishan Barbouti, however, was anything but disturbed.
Dr. Barbouti never even talked about the bitter almond oil and never even showed any interest in the bitter almond oil. He did say time after time that he wanted the cyanide complex that we make, which is a non-poisonous complex, but he always wanted us to have that shipped to Germany.
When you say complex, what do you mean by complex?
Well, what we're producing is a ferric ferrocyanide, which is a non-poisonous product. It's not a harmful product. In the wrong hands, you can extract out the pure cyanide, and it's extremely deadly.
Dr. Barbouti and Louis Champon became partners in the spring of 1988. By July, they had rented for $21,000 a month a nondescript building in Boca Raton, Florida, in an industrial park near Interstate 95. By late October, plans and specifications had been completed. Louis Champon still claims his only interest was in the development of a natural cherry flavoring, which he thought could be mass-produced and sold to a soft drink company. But as the CIA clearly knew, and as Robert Gates would say a few months later in his October speech, the technology for chemical weapons is not significantly more complicated than that required to produce soft drinks. Ishan Barbouti also understood the connection. Dr. Barbouti, remember, was not without experience. In fact, one of his other projects at that very time, late October of '88, was of primary concern to the director of the CIA, William Webster.
Libya, developing the largest chemical plant that I know of for chemical warfare and ability to influence policies in that area.
Webster was talking about the plant at Rabta. Libya was getting most of its equipment and chemicals for that plant from two companies in Germany, Imhausen Chemie and IBI, Ishan Barbouti Incorporated. The Reagan administration was so concerned about this German connection that it held a special high-level briefing in Washington for German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and his foreign minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher. Rick Burt was, at that time, U.S. ambassador to Bonn.
There was this very senior meeting with the German Chancellor, the German Foreign Minister, and several members of the cabinet, at which the Chancellor and the Foreign Minister were briefed on the facility in Libya and the information that we had about the assistance that the Libyans had received from Germany and other European countries.
As those briefings were underway, as the Secretary of State, the Director of the CIA, and the President's National Security Advisor were trying to convince the German government to move against the companies that were building Rabta, the owner of one of those companies was here in the United States. Dr. Barbouti had just given his final approval to design plans for the Boca Raton plant. It would be a pilot project to see how effectively cyanide could be extracted from fruit pits, which are, after all, in abundant supply throughout the Middle East. The attention of the U.S. government, however, was not focused on Dr. Barbouti's activities in Boca Raton, or for that matter, in Texas, where he was trying to acquire an anti-corrosive coating process for piping that could be used in nuclear or chemical weapons projects, or in Oklahoma, where Barbouti was trying to buy the formulas for advanced rocket fuel additives and the key ingredient for fuel-air explosives. No, the focus of U.S. government attention was on Germany and Libya. When the Germans refused to shut down the flow of chemicals to the plant at Rabta, the State Department leaked some highly classified material to the media. In a bitterly angry column, William Safire of the New York Times described the Rabta plant and its German suppliers as Auschwitz in the sand. By January of 1989, two carrier groups of the U.S. Navy were ordered to take up station off the Libyan coast. On January 4th, two U.S. F-14s shot down two Libyan MiGs over the Gulf of Sidra. At about the same time, construction was beginning at the cherry flavoring plant in Boca Raton, Florida. and the U.S. government didn't seem to know a thing about it.
I saw a company and a man who built a plant in a foreign country that we were going to bomb, chemical weapons being produced in this country, in my country, the United States. And what was wrong was it was being done almost literally in the open.
Peter Khawaja, who was hired by Dr. Barbouti to set up an elaborate security system for the Boca plant, tried to warn agencies of the U.S. government. Indeed, he was just one of several people who blew the whistle. But nothing, absolutely nothing, was done to shut the plant down. That part of the story, when we come back.
ABC News Nightline Financial Times investigation continues. Once again, Ted Koppel.
The U.S. government knew who Dr. Barbouti was. To use the government's own description, he was a linchpin of the Libyan chemical warfare plant at Rabta. Is it conceivable that U.S. government agencies could have been unaware of Dr. Barbouti's activities in this country? He did not, after all, maintain what you might call a low profile. He ran a network of companies and investments through which he channeled more than $100 million into real estate, shopping centers, and oil drilling rigs. But his particular passion was companies, particularly chemical companies, with dual-use technologies. Those, in other words, that had military as well as civilian application, like the natural cherry flavoring plant in Boca Raton. Peter Khawaja is a security specialist. In early 1989, he was hired to provide armed guards and an elaborate security system for the plant. Among the items he was told to install was a hydrogen cyanide detection system. Khawaja was also instructed to take armed teams of guards to Barbouti properties in Texas and Oklahoma. He provided bodyguards for Barbouti's partner, Louis Champon, and for Barbouti's college-aged son, Hyder.
Seemed too easy for the doctor or IBI to operate, if not prior to '88. In 1989, when the plant at Rabta became common knowledge, and IBI's role was exposed, Hyder Barbouti continued to move freely in the United States. IBI continued to wire transfer in millions and millions of dollars. IBI operated boldly. Barbouti felt no threat in operating in the United States.
Khawaja claims that in the spring of 1989, he called the CIA and told them about the plant in Boca Raton.
I basically outlined that the plant was being constructed by Dr. Barbouti, the same IBI and builder of the chemical weapons plant at Rabta. I identified myself. It was not an anonymous phone call or the first time possibly that I had contacted the CIA.
Since the CIA charter prohibits it from operating within the United States, Khawaja was told to contact the FBI.
After a lengthy conversation with the FBI, where the last agent, who seemed very knowledgeable about chemicals, chemical weapons, asking me some qualifying questionnaires as to whether it was powder or liquid, some basic questions, but they became intricate. At the end of the conversation, the agent told me that because the plant was a food processing plant, it would fall under the jurisdiction of the FDA, and that I should call the FDA.
What did you say to the FBI agent when he told you to go to the FDA?
I probably said, my mouth fell open. I'm not sure what I said exactly, but I was literally in shock.
Nor was Peter Khawaja the only person to contact the FBI. Art Valens was a senior vice president of Ishan Barbouti Industries in Houston. He and Barbouti had a falling out in July of 1989. Valens says he took a file of incriminating documents that he'd accumulated while running Barbouti's Texas operation.
I went to the FBI. I had bank account numbers and names from all of his European, if he had wire transferred money wire transferred money to me, IBI Industries Houston, or money had been wired from IBI Houston. I had kept a record of all of those transactions. Panama, Uruguay. When I realized, you know, what I thought was a bad situation for myself and that I had been set up, I went to the FBI and I said, look, if something happens to me, this is why. At that point, the FBI looked at me and he said, these are bad people. We know they're bad people. And I said, well, what do you propose I do? And he said, do you know how to shoot a gun? I said, yes, I do. And he said, it's a misdemeanor. Carry one. That was the end of the conversation. Sometime later, Customs contacted me and asked me if I would be interested in talking to them. And I said, absolutely. I told them what I had given the FBI, and he absolutely, that was very important information. He had contacted these people, and that information had gotten lost.
Two witnesses, then, who testify that by 1989, the CIA, the FBI, and U.S. Customs had been told about Dr. Barbouti's activities here in the United States. In point of fact, however, the CIA had been informed much earlier. Their informant was an Israeli-born U.S. citizen by the name of Moshe Tal. He ran a company based in Oklahoma City that had developed several fuel enhancement formulas which could be used in everything from jet aircraft to rockets, and that these formulas were made up of ingredients that could also be used in fuel-air explosives and in chemical and biological weapons. Barbouti was particularly taken by the fact that Tal's company had licenses to export these chemicals. In August of 1987, Barbouti arranged a meeting in Zurich at which he introduced Tal to a German identified only as Peter. Peter is actually Jürgen Hippenstiel, the other chemical manufacturer responsible for that Libyan chemical weapons plant at Rabda.
Dr. Barbouti gave me a list of chemicals that he wanted me to solicit and get basically a shipload of those chemicals to ship to the Rotterdam or to the Europe facility. And Peter went over with me over the chemical list, told me specifically which chemicals he would like to have in larger quantities, and, you know, the urgency of the need for those chemicals.
Tal had the list analyzed by experts. It was, they told him, a shopping list for chemical and biological weapons production. Tal contacts Israeli intelligence to find out more about Dr. Barbouti.
They asked me to get more detailed information about him, traveling documents, passport numbers, date of birth, things of this nature, and it took them several months. In March, about mid-March or a little bit after mid-March of 1988, they confirmed that he was the chief contractor for the Rabda chemical weapon plant.
In June of 1988, Tal made contact with Senator Dennis DeConcini, at that time a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. DeConcini passed the information on to William Webster, director of the CIA. On June 15, 1988, at Webster's direction, John Helgerson of the CIA wrote to Senator DeConcini, "We would like one of our officers to meet with Tal to determine whether he can provide any fresh insights into the activities and contacts of Dr. Barbouti." A period of intensive contact between Moshe Tal and the CIA began in July of '88.
Well, they were interested basically in everything I had on him. It seems that at the very beginning they didn't have much, so they wanted to know the detail on everything, what he liked to eat, how he walked, what he liked to do, where was he staying, what did he say, the companies, any document that could show his ties or companies or telephone number, telexes, faxes. They really wanted to know about his movement.
For months, Tal and his CIA handler maintained almost daily telephone contact. Tal wanted to break off his relationship with Barbouti. The CIA asked him to keep it going.
Well, I was asked by the CIA to keep in touch with them until about December of 1988. Until that time, they asked me to act like I do want to do the deal with them. I used that as a vehicle of getting a lot of information about Dr. Barbouti whereabouts.
In March of 1988, there was a chilling convergence of events. The war between Iraq and Iran was winding down. In a Kurdish village by the name of Halabja, Saddam Hussein's forces used chemical weapons against their own people. There was international outrage.
It was clear that entire families had been struck down together. Their bodies showed.
Has once again led to an international outcry against the Iraqis.
A few months later, in August of 1988, Moshe Tal informed his CIA contact of Dr. Barbouti's plant in Boca Raton, and that the Barboutis were trying to buy HC, or hydrogen cyanide detection units.
I gave him basically all the information on it, telephone number, addresses, the expenditure, which seems to be very large. 500 times the production is quite a lot. The HC detection unit. They seemed like they were very excited about it, but they, I don't know if you ever dealt with the CIA, they're well trained and they hear and they don't talk.
So we're talking about in August of '88, you supplied this information, yet the plant, subsequent to that, the plant was designed, built, constructed, operated, and in fact never shut down. How do you explain that?
It seems like Barbouti or some of his people had a lot of pull in Washington. It seems like every time it had to go through Washington was somehow slowed down.
Moshe Tal was told by Barbouti that he was supplying Iraq with weapons. Tal insists he passed that information on to the CIA. They didn't seem to care.
When I approached the CIA, or when I met with the CIA, it seems that Iraq was not a concern to them. They didn't want to concentrate on that. They were more interested in Libya.
By 1989, the cherry flavoring plant in Boca Raton was not only producing a special cyanide that could be used in the development of battlefield-grade poison gas, it was shipping samples of the cyanide to Iraq, and doing so with the help of a long-term CIA contract employee. When we come back, we'll follow the trail of that shipment from Florida to Baghdad.
ABC News Nightline Financial Times investigation continues. Here again, Ted Koppel.
As we've told you, Ishan Barbouti's Boca Raton plant that extracted natural cherry flavoring from fruit pits produced cyanide as a byproduct. His partner, Louis Champon, still can't account for all the cyanide that was produced.
To the best of my knowledge, I know that we're missing approximately 7 empty drums from our plant, and I believe now that approximately 2,000 pounds have been taken out of the plant.
We've been able to track in some detail the path that the shipment took. Our information comes from 2 arms dealers and shippers whose contract employment with the CIA has been confirmed for us by sources on Capitol Hill and within the Bush administration. Our sources claim that the drums of cyanide were taken by truck from Boca Raton to the port of Houston. There they were crated and shipped to the port of Baltimore, where they were transferred to a 20-foot container. According to our sources, that container was marked as containing the personal effects of a diplomat, and thus would not have been subject to inspection by U.S. Customs. The container, including the cyanide, was then loaded aboard a ship which left Baltimore in November of 1989, arriving in Europe about 2 weeks later. In Europe, it was transferred to another ship, this time bound for Aqaba, Jordan, then trucked overland to Iraq. 2 independent sources who claim a direct role in the shipment say that the transportation was coordinated with the U.S. government, and that the arrangements were handled by an Iraqi intelligence officer from the embassy here in Washington. The amount of cyanide shipped from Florida to Baghdad was, as far as we can tell, relatively small. But the shipment, our sources tell us, was to be used in the trial manufacture of a nerve gas. If those tests were successful, then a seemingly innocent plant could, with minimal fear of detection, provide Iraq with the formula to produce a chemical weapon from fruit pits, a commodity in plentiful supply in Iraq. There is no question that the FBI and the CIA knew who Dr. Barbouti was and of his connection with the Rabta chemical weapons plant in Libya. Barbouti, in fact, was able to operate so freely in this country that there is strong reason to believe that he and the CIA were cooperating. He could have been an extremely useful intelligence source on operations in Libya and Iraq. But that would still not explain why he was permitted to develop a chemical weapons precursor in Florida at a time when Washington was putting exceptional pressure on the Bonn government to close down Barbouti's operations in Germany. Nor would it explain why the Senate Intelligence Committee was left in the dark on the operation, as its chairman claims it was. It is, at the very least, embarrassing evidence that the U.S. government gave extraordinary latitude here in the United States to a major chemical weapons supplier of both Libya and Iraq at the time that the Libyan plant of Rabta was under construction, at the time that Iraqi Kurds were gassed and killed at Halabja, at a time when the director and the deputy director of the CIA were issuing public warnings about the dangers of chemical weapons in the Third World. There are still a number of unanswered questions, and when we come back, we'll address some of those as I'm joined by Alan Friedman, the New York correspondent for the Financial Times of London. Joining me now, one of our colleagues in this ongoing investigation, Alan Friedman of the Financial Times of London. Alan, why was it necessary for Barbouti to ship that cyanide to Iraq? Why not just send the formula?
Ted, those shipments were actually cyanide samples that the Iraqis wanted to be able to prove that the process worked. What they were trying to do is get from Boca Raton enough quantities, not militarily significant, but just enough to show that this could be produced as an extract and could be used in a larger scale plant in Iraq.
Now, some of the people who've been talking to us obviously had their own motives for doing so. You want to get into some of that?
Well, we have a variety of sources. Some of them are suing Dr. Barbouti in civil suits, broken contracts, a variety of things. They certainly have axes to grind, but many of them did go to the CIA, the FBI, and other agencies and tell them of their suspicions about this plant.
So you're suggesting that because they have civil suits, they wanted to paint him as badly as possible, demonize him as much as possible?
They certainly now in their civil suits want to show that he was a bad man, but at the time they were going to the U.S. authorities.
What do you think was the primary reason that agencies of the U.S. government gave as much freedom to Barbouti to operate in this country as apparently they did?
Well, that's a question we've been looking at, and we have been told by Dr. Barbouti's own lawyer that at the time of the Rabta affair, he was in contact with the CIA.
The lawyer or?
Dr. Barbouti was in contact with the CIA. The lawyer didn't elaborate why. We've also been told by some of the federal investigators that they surmise that being in London all those years, Dr. Barbouti may have been in a relationship with British secret services. And Moshe Tal, one of our sources, told us that Dr. Barbouti told him directly he had a deal with Western intelligence to supply information on Iraq and Libya in exchange for being taken care of by the Brits.
What is it that you can draw from this particular story with regard to how the Iraqi procurement network operated in this country?
Well, clearly what we're finding in our investigation in this story is that there was a great deal of latitude for Iraqi intelligence people, Iraqi procurement agents to operate throughout the U.S. They bought companies, they made investments, they were really not touched. Indeed, what we're looking at now, and which will be coming up, is how the Iraqis may have penetrated a major U.S. corporation. So clearly we're finding a pattern here of lots of information that the U.S. government had and lots of Iraqi activity which was not prosecuted.
Now, in the few seconds we have left, a name that came up at the beginning of this broadcast, I want to raise it again now because the Robert Gates nomination for director of the CIA is going to be coming up very soon. How does he figure into this, and what impact do you think this story and others like it will have on his nomination?
Well, we've been told that congressional investigators are looking into the Barbouti affair. It'll be up to members of the Senate Intelligence Committee whether they question him or not. But at the time of the Iran-Contra matter, when Mr. Gates was nominated and withdrew his nomination in February 1987, the issue there was senators were uncomfortable about the account he gave, the amount of knowledge he said he had or did not have about the Iran-Contra scandal. In this case, we've seen that in June '88, the director of the CIA, Webster, was tracking Barbouti, was personally involved in that. Gates was his deputy. The question, I suppose, that will be asked is, whether Gates had any personal knowledge of the Barbouti affair, and if he did, what did he know, and when did he know it?
Alan, thank you. I'll be back in a moment with reaction from the White House, the CIA, U.S. Customs, and the FBI, and I'll have a closing note. This is an awkward time for the Bush administration to be reminded of its curious tolerance in the late 1980s and through 1990 for the brutal regime of Saddam Hussein. It is a particularly awkward time to discover that the CIA and the FBI tolerated not only the presence, but the business activities of a chemical arms dealer here in the United States, whose principal clients appear to have been Libya and Iraq. The administration is justifiably angry that Saddam Hussein is being so deceptive about his nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons programs. But is that anger quite as justifiable when it turns out that some of the technology was transferred from the United States, and in some cases with the apparent knowledge of U.S. government agencies? We have requested reaction to our story tonight from a number of federal agencies. The CIA had this statement. CIA was made aware of some allegations that Dr. Barbouti was undertaking activities in support of the proliferation of weapons in the Middle East. In keeping with our legal and professional responsibilities, such information was turned over to the appropriate law enforcement agencies. So we turned to the FBI. Their statement was even less helpful. We do not feel that we have anything that we could lend to your story. The White House simply supported the statement we got from the CIA and said it didn't want to go beyond that. Customs at least implied that someone is looking into the charges. We cannot comment, they said, on any ongoing investigation. Earlier today, at a quiet graveyard in the English county of Surrey, a team of masons hoisted a black marble stone over what is said to be Dr. Ishan Barbouti's final resting place. The inscriptions are in Arabic and English. The English one reads, "His life, a beautiful memory. His absence, a silent grief. Forever in our thoughts." That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
This has been an ABC News Nightline Financial Times investigation. If you wish a videocassette version of Nightline, the cost is $14.98, plus $3.95 shipping and handling. If you wish a printed transcript of this or any Nightline broadcast, please send $4 to Nightline Transcripts, 267 Broadway, New York, New York, 10007.
Nightline is a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.